I'll begin by introducing Dr. Raymond Lorian, the Dean of College of Education.
This is just an example of what protocol looks like because I'm going to, in a few moments, introduce Bob, who just introduced me. I just want to welcome everybody who came. This is a very important event for us. Hearing from somebody such as Professor Ayers, and I warned him I would refer to him as Professor Ayers. He said I could also use Bill or Hey You. I will let Bob, who knows him much better, refer to him as Hey You. Anyways, thank you for coming. The important part of this is not only to listen to what Professor Ayers is going to talk about, but I know what he particularly wants, and it was evident in how he signs autographs, is he wants dialogue. He wants conversation. So I really encourage you to ask questions, and if there's a question you think you shouldn't ask, he probably wants to hear those more than anything else. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Robert Blake, who's the chair of the Department of Elementary Ed. Bob.
Yeah, and actually that microphone's backwards, but that's okay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you, Bill, for coming. Thank you for everybody for coming. Thank you for Ray for sponsoring this. I do have a question. How many students are here? Woohoo! That's over half. I like it. All right. How many were forced to buy his book? That's right. It's supposed to be a good book. No, it's a good book. But it is a great pleasure to have Bill Ayers here. Bill was my professor at University of Illinois Chicago, along with my sister Brett and along with Steve Mogi. Wave, Steve. And if I missed anybody else who had Bill Ayers as a professor at University of Illinois Chicago, please raise your hand. Nope, nope, nope. That's the three of us. I'm going to take advantage of the 30 seconds of fame that I actually have in this lectern, because this will probably be the most people I ever talk to for the rest of my life. So you're going to be stuck with me for a few seconds. But it's not, seriously, this is not about me. This is about our speaker. Got a few notes to myself. Bill's a former distinguished professor of education and senior university scholar at University of Illinois Chicago. I have to put it up here, but then the bifocals aren't working. And then that old age. He has a long storied history in education, and I'm just going to list and read off some of the titles of books. These are just books in education. The Good Preschool Teacher, 6 teachers reflect on their lives. To become a teacher, making a difference in children's lives. Teacher Lore, learning from our own experience. Teaching for Social Justice, a Democracy and Education Reader. To Teach, The Journey of a Teacher, which is kind of where I stole the title of tonight's talk today. And then those of you that have Teaching the Taboo, they wrote with his brother, Rick Ayers, Teaching the Taboo, Courage and Imagination in the Classroom. And this is not to mention countless articles and forwards, and oh, by the way, an afterword that he wrote in the book that my sister and I edited right there. I just had to throw that one in there, which is not, by the way, on your Vita, if I have to tell you. No. Becoming a Teacher, Using Narrative as a Reflective Practice, a Cross-Disciplinary Approach. Remember, I have a few minutes, so I can embellish. I lied. But what I wanted to start with, it's kind of interesting when I get to a position like this in my career. Started teaching in 1988, went to University of Illinois Chicago, I think started in 1991. Didn't really know the people and who were around me, but when I look back retrospectively, I start thinking about the movie The Commitments. Anybody ever seen the movie The Commitments? Thank you. It's the Dubliners in Ireland trying to form a soul band, and they had to find, I think it was a guitarist, I can't remember, and they had an advertisement, and people would come to their door, and they'd open up the door, and the first question they asked is, who are your influences? And if they said soft cell or something like that, they'd slam the door on them. But I would talk real briefly about my influences, because I think it brings me to where I am today and brings us where we are today with Bill Ayers coming here. First off, we had Ted Sizer at Brown University, who taught us that schools are thoughtful places, good schools especially are thoughtful places, and that knowing and respecting the child is a crucial piece of teaching that child. Ted Sizer passed away in 2009, but you can find a lot of what he's done with the Coalition of Essential Schools online. Then you go to University of Illinois, Chicago, and of course, being somewhat green and naive, I didn't know what I was doing or getting myself into, but I think about Bill Schubert, curriculum specialist, who asks us, what is most worthwhile to know and experience? And what's really funny is when I first heard that, I thought, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But when I look back at it, I'm like, that was the smartest thing I ever heard. Kind of like the kid, how they get smarter when they get older with their parents, but that's another side note. David Hansen, who was there, who's now at Teachers College, encouraged us to explore and value the moral heart of teaching, and what we try to bring and what we want to deal with and how we want to deal with children. Corinna Ethington, a.k.a. Bunny Ethington, which is really interesting because she was my dissertation chair, but she was, she was a statistician. But what she taught me in particular, and those of us that had her classes, there is a difference between statistical significance and practical significance. And for me, that was a very powerful statement. And then Bill, of course, encouraged us to value the human experience and the story lives of teachers and students, and you can see that in his titles that he had. And one of the key things that I always picked up from him is, especially in the notion of interpretive inquiry and observational inquiry, we get to the general through the specific. We can't make generalizations off generalizations. We have to get a lot of detail. We have to be immersed into it. And that's where we can make, if we do, make generalities. I mention this because at the time of UIC, there was a perception, at least my perception, and I'm not going to speak for anybody else, about this little tussle between methodological processes in education research. It was in simplistic terms, it was the battle of quantitative versus qualitative. And it was I don't know, maybe I was just kind of, again, naive and didn't know what was going on, but quantitative was steeped in statistical methodology, employing terms and ideas of validity and reliability. I mean, I spent still years trying to figure out what that means. I shouldn't admit that because the dean's sitting right there. Hypothesis testing, large N's, large sample sizes, statistical significance, what's your p-value, objectivity and answers. The idea of what's your question, and if you can't write it down on a little matchbook cover, you don't know what the heck you're doing. And so those are some of the things that were coming, and I don't want to be snarky, even though I did find that definition that says snarky is a very popular, or not popular, but a positive. But qualitative focused on thick descriptions, ethnography, small N's, like an N of 1, a single case study, that was okay. Cultural descriptions, terms like structural corroboration, accuracy, comprehensiveness, theme development, and theory building, and the notion that subjectivity was inevitable and even can be a strength. Example, an insider has, like a teacher, does have a different perspective of what's going on in the classroom than an outsider. That can be a strength, and that is something that we learn. So there's that little tussle going on this, and I mention that because tonight I think we're going to get some information, we'll get some background and talk about the storied lives of teachers, storied lives of children, storied lives of people, how much we can learn about the storied lives of people. My thinking is we use that to get at the necessity of the ongoings of a classroom that can at times give us more than what a p-value will give us. Just some thoughts. For me, I lean on George Schaller. I don't know if anybody knows George Schaller, one of the preeminent animal behaviorists of our time, naturalist. He wrote a book, The Last Panda. He's written a lot of books. And one of the quotes in there just really hits home with me and what Bill will bring tonight to the discussion. He says in his book, The Last Panda, hey, listen, this is a story about the panda, the life of the panda in the mountains of China, the sorry tale of the panda. If you really want to know how many dung samples I collected and had analyzed, go to my technical report, because this is not in here. He makes the statement, lacking in such reports is the human factor, the joy of discovery, the pleasure of new insight, the admission that research is sporadic and haphazard, and the fact that information is not as objective as one would like to think. Statistics may help us to describe the universe, but not other beings. Numbers cannot convey the quality of a creature. They cannot express love, anger, joy, and courage. A fact is not a fact until someone has posed a question, and slowly the world of an animal emerges from the questions raised and the facts collected. But if someone else asks a different question, a different creature, a different reality comes into existence. With that, I introduce Bill Ayers.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, all of you, for being here. Hi, Steve. Didn't see you come in. I was reminded as you were introducing me and making me feel important that when I got my doctorate, actually, which was in 1987, my son Malik, who is now a middle school math science teacher in Oakland, was waiting outside, and I came out and he said, "Did you win?" Which I thought was amusing. And then he said, "Well, you're a doctor now, but not the kind that can help anybody, right?" And I said, "Exactly." So I'm kind of overwhelmed with that very generous and kind introduction. I was sitting here signing books, and those of you who were in line, you all, I know what order you were in, so don't leave. But I was getting more and more worried, and so I realized most people in here, some of you are faculty and some are graduate students, but most of you are undergraduates who are becoming teachers, right? And so I got worried as I was signing the books, and so I had to ask you two questions before I start. One is, are any of you going into teaching because you think you're going to get rich? Raise your hand. No? You're smirking at me. Okay. Anybody going into teaching because you think you'll be carried around the community on the shoulders of the business community, and they'll all say, "Hooray!" for no? Okay, good. Then I don't have to start at the very beginning. I thought I'd start near the beginning, but I don't have to go to the very beginning. You won't get rich. And I've never seen a time in our history where teachers have been in some ways less respected and less valued than this particular moment, which is a troubling thing to me because I've spent my life worrying about, thinking about, believing in the power of teaching. But I do want to start with kind of first principle. Oh, and did anybody tell you not to teach? Yeah. Who told you not to teach, for example? Just what kind of person? Your parents, of course. Why am I spending all this money on education? You're going to be a teacher. Who else told you not to teach? Teachers. Yeah, other teachers. Right, that's a frightening thought. Brothers, sisters, partners, boyfriends, girlfriends. People have told you not to teach. They say incongruous things like, "You're a smart young woman. You could be a bank clerk." And you're like, "What? Why would I be a bank clerk?" Or you could be a lawyer and read the warranties on toaster ovens the rest of your life, you know. I mean, it just astonishes me how many of us, and this includes me, fought our way into teaching against a whole chorus saying, "Don't teach, don't teach." And yet, here you are. So either there's something very wrong with you, and then I have to do therapy, or there's something very right with you. And I choose to think there's something very right with you. But I do want to talk about, I want to go to kind of first principles and begin at the beginning, which is kind of asking questions like, what is teaching for? Who is the teacher? Who are the students? And what are your responsibilities and commitments to them? What does an excellent classroom look like? And how would you know? And I want to start there. But I also want to be in dialogue with you. So I want to give you permission to interrupt me as I go along, hold up signs or banners, or else I'll try to speak for maybe 30 minutes and then get into a conversation with you. And we'll talk about this, but this isn't the best environment for a dialogue, but we can have a dialogue in this environment, I promise. So starting at the beginning, I guess for me, the beginning is I began teaching in 1965. And from then until now, my partner has been a lawyer. And so I've often found myself, sometimes incongruously, at lawyer parties. And at lawyer parties, the drama was always the same. We'd be standing around drinking wine and eating cheese, and some lawyer would say to me, "What do you do?" And I thought it was an innocent enough question. And depending on the year, I'd say, "I teach kindergarten," or "I teach preschool," or "I teach in the juvenile detention center," all of which I've done. And the response was always the same. So the dialogue, "What do you do?" My response, "I teach kindergarten." And then there's this patronizing, pitying look on the face of the lawyer as he tries to figure out what you say to a guy who just said, I teach kindergarten, right? And he would give me this kind of slow kind of smile and then say, that must be very interesting. And then he'd go off to talk to somebody actually interesting. You've had that kind of experience, right? Where somebody, why are you teaching, right? That whole thing that we were just talking about. And so over time, I got what I considered a snappy response. And then it would go like this. The lawyer would say, what do you do? And I'd say, I teach kindergarten. It's the most intellectually demanding thing I've ever done. And I recommend that to you because it always causes the lawyer's head to snap as he tries to figure out, what do you say to a guy? How do you put those together? Intellectual, teach, kindergarten, does not compute. And then he'd give me a deeper patronizing smile and a pitying look and go off and talk to somebody actually interesting. He'd say, that must be very, very interesting. So what I want to talk about, it really is kind of unpacking a little bit about what I meant when I say teaching kindergarten was the most intellectually demanding thing I've ever done. And I want to unpack that a little, but I never really got to unpack it with the lawyer because he'd already left, right? So then I developed what I consider an even better response. And I recommend this to you. Then I'd be at the party, drinking wine, eating cheese, and the lawyer would say, so what do you do? And I'd say, I teach kindergarten. It's the most intellectually demanding thing I've ever done. And if you want to get over making six figures and do something useful with your life, and then I'd run out of breath. But I'm only partly kidding, because I think part of the problem that we face is really in our hands. And the problem is, how do we develop a vocabulary, an understanding, a depth of communication that explains what it is we actually do, not the stereotype of what teachers are, not the stereotype of what kindergartners or first graders or seventh graders or high schoolers alike, not the kind of movie version of what teaching is, but a real substantive sense of what it is we do. And then, not just with random lawyers at lawyer parties, but with your parents, with your boyfriends and girlfriends, with your brothers and sisters, with your colleagues, you can develop a way of talking about teaching that elevates it into the really, truly intellectual and ethical work that it honestly is. And that's what I want to talk about just for a minute. I began teaching in kindergarten, preschool actually, but 5-year-olds. And I remember I was 15 minutes into my first teaching gig when a 5-year-old said to me, why does the ball bounce? And I remember I felt like a deer caught in headlights. I was like, oh, damn, I don't even know that. I've been a teacher for 15 minutes, and the 5-year-old stumped me, right? And it was a horrifying feeling. But it got worse as the morning wore on, because by the end of that first morning, it was clear that the levels of my ignorance were vast. I didn't know, for example, why the sky was blue. I didn't know why my skin was pink and her skin was brown. I didn't know why really tricky things like, why is that man sleeping in the gutter on the Upper West Side of New York City when we walked to the park? Why? And I don't know how to answer these things. Luckily, that first morning, somebody asked me why the floor was sticky when she spilled the apple juice. Thank God I knew that. Incidentally, I still don't know why the ball bounces. It's now 50 years later, or almost 50 years later, and I'm not sure. Although a physicist tried to explain it to me, my brother-in-law. But it created for me a huge crisis for me as a teacher. But it was a crisis that took me a while to unpack and unwind, but it turned out to be a very creative crisis. And it's a crisis, it's a problem that I'm still trying to understand. I'm still trying to figure it out. And I guess the way I could describe the crisis best is that I thought a teacher was somebody who knew stuff and communicated that stuff to people who were in the audience. In other words, I thought teaching was like what I'm doing now. You got to the podium, you had a microphone, the well-behaved little bastards, the kids, sat there and took in whatever you gave them. And it turns out that isn't really the best image of teaching, even though it's a very common image of teaching. It's an image of teaching that is kind of in our DNA, even if we see it as more than that. We still think, don't I have to have a lesson plan and know what I'm doing? Don't I have information to communicate? Isn't that the heart and soul of the matter? And it turns out it's really not. And that first crisis really led me in a direction that I think became much truer and richer, not just for me, but I think for my understanding of what teaching could be. And the image that evolved over those first couple of years was that teaching, far from being the master and commander standing at the podium delivering the goods, you could think of teaching much more as being on a voyage with your students. You could be on a voyage with your students, and the voyage is a voyage of discovery and surprise. It's not that you need to pre-digest things that you give to them. It's that you need to be open to the world in such a way that you're willing to explore that world with them in its many dimensions. And I'll speak a little bit about what that exploration looks like. But the key thing was I began to understand and think of teaching as a set of challenges. And I want to tell you what I think those challenges are, because I commend them to you. I think of them as, let's say, 3 or 4 to begin with, intellectual challenges. And we could turn those into commitments in a minute. The first challenge of teaching for me, and I hope for you, becomes the challenge to see the students before you as 3-dimensional creatures, much like yourself. That is, people with hearts and minds and spirits and experiences and hopes and dreams that have to somehow be taken into account. In other words, there is no such thing as this passive, accepting person sitting in the front row. That's not actually what's happening. What's happening is children in their squirrely variety are making meaning of what you're saying and doing. And they're making meaning alongside you. But it turns out they already know a lot. Let me give you an example from a recent experience in my life. I told a couple of you I have 3 grandchildren. My youngest grandchild is now 18 months old, but I was at the birth of this child. So that was 18 months ago, and it was, you probably, most of you have not attended a birth, but it's amazing. I can tell you, it's incredible. I recommend it if you get a chance. But okay, so we went through this birth, and it was a difficult birth, and it went on for a long, long time, and finally the baby was born with a cesarean section. And the baby was about 5 minutes old when they swaddled him up, and they brought him to his mother and put him on his mother's chest, right? Now, you can picture this scene, even if you've never seen a birth. Can't you picture this? You know, they swaddle babies now. They make them little tight little mummies. It's really cute. But okay, so here's this little swaddled baby. Now his mother, who's 28 years old or 29 years old at the time, she's read a lot of books about nursing. She's consulted her mother and her mother-in-law. She's talked to her older sister and her friends. She's read books, and she's even joined La Leche League, which is an advocacy group for nursing mothers. And so my question to you is, picturing that scene with the baby on her chest, who was teaching whom how to nurse? Who was the teacher and who was the student? And some of you are smiling because you know the answer. And the answer is, if you think it was the mother, you've got it half right, but only half right. And if you think it was the baby, you've got it half right. In reality, what was happening was the first dialogue of learning was going on at 5 minutes old. In other words, she knew a lot. She knew to try this and try that, but immediately the baby spoke back to her. Not this way, that way. Not quite like that, a little more like this. Too much, and he's 5 minutes old. If he can communicate that dialogue with her, if he can start that dialogue with her at 5 minutes old, and being this new mother, she was completely receptive to the dialogue. She wanted the dialogue. She wanted him to tell her what to do. She wasn't so sure. She was nervous, just like you're going to be when you step into your classroom, nervous. But she trusted the dialogue, and she trusted herself that she could learn, and she trusted him that he could teach her. So think about it. If in the first 5 minutes the baby can teach the mother something, what about 5 years? What about 15 years? What about 25? What about you? Don't you have things to teach your professors? You're an expert on your own life. You know more about your experience than they do. You know, and I don't just mean, how to tag that on Facebook, but tag that on Facebook. I'm not sure what that means, but I like saying it. But you get my point. My point can simply be stated this way. The intellectual challenge of teaching is to see the student before the blizzard of labels, beyond the blizzard of labels, as a three-dimensional creature who has something to teach you. And the real gesture of teaching that's difficult to perform but essential is to unlock the wisdom in the room, is to find the wisdom in the room. Every kid comes with wisdom. How do you unlock that wisdom? So in schools where we have developed the toxic habit of labeling kids by their deficits, it's important to remember that they have a perspective, a point of view, an experience, a hope, a dream, an intelligence that has to be taken into account. And we have to look at the kid beyond the toxic habit of labeling. So when I say toxic habit of labeling, I don't know if that resonates for you, but what I mean by that is when I started teaching in 1965, we said about some kids, there are some kids you're going to encounter out in the schools who are culturally deprived. Now, that's not language that you young people know, but the old people know it, right? Some of the kids are culturally deprived. And it was a condition that the kids had, like freckles or blonde hair or something, and it was a condition of their lives. Now, that language, cultural deprivation, was not only patronizing, but it kind of had an inherently racist kind of tone to it. So smart educators of my generation defeated that language. And we said, no, there's no such thing as cultural deprivation. There may be financial deprivation. There may be differences. And it was in that moment that multicultural education got some traction and became an idea. That concept has fallen on its own cliched hard times. But at least it was an insurgent idea against the patronizing notion of cultural deprivation. So we were taught to go into our classes and look for them. Oh, there they are. Those are the culturally deprived ones over there. And, it was a language that was just, ugh. So we got rid of it. But in getting rid of it, there's been a proliferation of those kinds of labels that has absolutely dwarfed whatever we thought we were saying back then. Now we have BD, LD, EMH, TAG. I don't even know what these things mean, but we have a whole alphabet soup that we apply to kids. And what happens when we do that too intensely is that the kids themselves disappear. And incidentally, the one thing that all the kids you're going to meet is they have a condition called at risk. I actually was at an early childhood conference, and some professor had given a paper called At Risk in the Kindergarten. So I went up to him and I went up to him afterwards and I said, what does at risk mean? But tell me it in Peter Rabbit English. I don't speak research, just give it to me, simple. And he said, at risk, it's simple. It means a non-native English language speaker or a minority or poor or single mother or, he went on like this. And I said, it's culturally deprived. He said, yes, but we don't use that language anymore. So great progress we've made. We moved beyond the racist language of culturally deprived. Now everybody's at risk. And at risk has the same danger of putting the blame on the kid, him or herself, whatever the blame is you think you're ascribing, and taking the responsibility away from, for example, the state legislature. I want to say the state legislature in Illinois is at risk, my God. And speaking of standards, why don't we have a standard for them about, fair funding and so on. But the point is, you are going to go into schools where you are going to encounter a blizzard of labels. And the first challenge to you, the first intellectual challenge, the first ethical challenge, is to see beyond the labels to the real human beings who are there before you. Three-dimensional creatures just like you. And I think I would turn this, I'm still on this first intellectual challenge, but I want to turn it slightly and say, I think one of the things you all ought to do while you're students is make a list of commitments. I really want you to do this, and you don't have to do it now, but I want you to make a list of commitments that you're taking with you into school. I'm committed to this and this and this and this. And if you make a list of 5 or 10 commitments and you put it up on your mirror, so you see it every morning, then you'll remind yourself that this is why you went into teaching. I mean, I don't think any of you went into teaching. As I said in the beginning, you went into teaching against a blizzard of people telling you not to. But did any of you decide to go into teaching because you say you were 12 years old and you just couldn't wait to sort the kids into winners and losers? Anybody? Was that your motive? No. Okay, good. Anybody go in because you had a great classroom management scheme when you were 8 years old and you just couldn't wait to? I don't think so. So you went into teaching for something higher than that. Get in touch with that higher something, which isn't well represented in colleges of education, and it's certainly not represented in the schools you're going to be there, but that you're going to teach in. But I think it's worthwhile to say, this is why I'm becoming a teacher. This is what I'm committed to. And that first intellectual challenge, let me change that into a commitment. I wish you would write commitment number 1, because this is one I really feel strongly about. It's my first commitment, and I want it to be your first commitment, so I'm begging you. But my first commitment is, I will see every child that comes into my classroom as a person of incalculable value. Every child who comes into my classroom is a person of incalculable value. I'm going to treat that kid not as an object, not as a thing. I'm going to treat that person as a full human being, worthy of my awe, worthy of my reverence, worthy of my respect. I want you to make that commitment. Every human being is of incalculable value. And I think that, now, having said that that's my commitment, I can't turn people into objects. I can't turn people into stereotypes. Can I live up to that every day? Do I live up to it every day? Last week, a guy almost crashed into me on Lakeshore Drive, driving recklessly. I wanted to strangle him. You bastard, I thought. Was I living up to my value? No, I was failing at my value. I was falling short of my value. So should I rip that value up? Should I say, no, then I'm not that person? Then that's a stupid, naive, romantic, something I learned in college nonsense? No, I think I should say, I fell short. I'm a human being. I'll forgive myself this time and try harder next time. That's what it means to say I have a commitment. So commitment number 1, every human being is valuable. When they come into my classroom, I'm going to treat them that way, no matter what. No matter if there are too many kids, no matter if there are too many restrictions. So that's number 1. A second intellectual challenge, which goes to a second commitment as well, is the idea that is the challenge of seeing the environment for learning as something that's hugely important to as a third teacher almost. If you think of the first teacher as the parents and you're the second teacher, the environment for learning is the third teacher. And you have to then attend to it. And again, most schools won't value you attending to it. Most colleges of education won't pay much attention to it. But it's of huge importance. So I'm committed to creating an environment where kids can be seen, where they can see one another as full human beings, where I can see them for the valuable people they are. I wrote a book about kids in juvenile detention called A Kind and Just Parent, and I focused on a couple of remarkable teachers. One was a former priest. And Frank Tobin, the former priest, would say to me, and he worked with all kids who were charged as adults. So they had been charged with serious adult-sized crimes. And Frank was this little nerdy Irishman with a red face and a pocket protector. Kids loved him because he loved them unequivocally, unabashedly. And it was really a sight to see. But he would say to me, I create an environment where these kids have to show me their goodness. Whew, there's a challenge. How do you create an environment where they have to show you their goodness? I'll let you ponder that, and I could give you my 2 cents on it, and show you what Frank did. But the environment is a hugely important teacher. It tells you what to do. Like, take this environment. None of you came in here and walked up to the podium and started speaking at the mic. Why not? There are no Towson police here. Oh, sorry. There are. I take it back. But, he wouldn't have stopped you. I mean, you could have come up here, but you knew better than to come up here because you knew that somebody was going to come up here. And those of you who got here early sat in the middle, not too close, because I might call on you or, spit on you or something, whatever, not too far. Unfortunately, this is, often in an auditorium, if you get there early, you sit in the back so you can sneak out without being noticed. Unfortunately, you're trapped here. You can't get away. But this environment tells you what to do. You get what I'm saying. When I was first teaching, I used to take my kids to the Detroit Metropolitan Airport, right? And that was before 9/11, before all the security, before the airports had turned into shopping malls. And I have 8 5-year-olds with me, and we get to the head of Concourse A. You can picture Concourse A at the Detroit airport? You know what it looks like visually? What would my 5-year-olds do? What did they do when we got to Concourse A? Tell me what they did. Yeah, of course. They ran. If you know a 5-year-old and you can picture a concourse, of course they ran, because the concourse said, run, go this way. It's a narrow, straight hall, lots of space. They just ran. So the next time I took them, I was 20 years old. This hapless teacher chasing them, like with a butterfly net trying to ring them in. The next time I took them, I told them, look, you have to hold hands with your partner. Here's your trip book. You have to, draw in the trip book and so on. And when we get to the end of the hallway, I'll give you, M&Ms. And, I had the whole positive, negative reinforcement thing going on. And then we got to the head of Concourse A, and what did they do? Of course. I was telling them one thing, and the concourse seemed to have a big sign that said, run, run, and they just ran. It took me 4 trips to understand that the environment trumps the lesson. And that's a very important thing for you to understand, because you should attend to the environment. You should pay attention to the environment. You want your kids to read, don't you? You want them to be literate, don't you? Well, is your environment literate? This is an illiterate environment right here. This is not a literate environment. This is not an environment that encourages speaking and reading and writing, but your classroom space should do that. When Robert or someone else comes to visit you 5 years from now, what will your classroom say, even without the kids there, to a visitor who doesn't know you? What values will it represent? The intellectual challenge is to create an environment that's deep enough and wide enough and broad enough so that every kid coming through the door finds something familiar and something challenging, something to do and something to make, something that's living and something that's creating. And you can do that, but it takes a lot of work. It's not easy. Part of this is also a psychological environment. I'm thinking about my youngest son is now 33 years old, and we adopted him when he was 14 months old, and he had a very difficult childhood, and he was a very difficult child. So when we took him to first grade, I was very intent and worried about what the first grade teacher would say at the first parent conference. So when we were getting ready for the parent conference, I was getting all steamed up, all ready to fight with this teacher, And I was, I think, 43 or 44 years old at this point, and the teacher was 28, so I was older than him. I was a professor. My wife's a law professor, and I was just certain he was going to tell me all the rotten things about my kid, which I knew only too well, and I was going to have to fight with him, so I was all ready. So we walk into the classroom, and I want you to write this down or inscribe it on your mind, because this was a brilliant gesture. Walk into the classroom, we're going to have our first parent meeting, and Kevin Sweeney says to us after greeting us and so on, he begins the meeting by saying, you know more about your son than I will ever know. What can you tell me about him that will make me a better teacher? And I could feel the air go out of me. I wanted to fight. And now what am I going to do? So I mumbled something about Well, Chase has temper tantrums that I could almost feel the teacher saying, really, no shit. You know, I mean, it's the most obvious thing about the kid, right? But it was amazing that that gesture opened a dialogue instead of closing a door. I was ready to have the door slammed in my face and try to kick it down. And he was smart enough to say, let's open this door. Let's find a way to communicate about the object of our intimacy. Let's think about it. And after a bit, he said something that has stayed with me forever. He had a beautiful classroom, first grade classroom, whole wall of unit blocks to build with, whole wall of easels. He had red, blue, and yellow paint at the easels. Why did he have red, yellow, blue, and paint at the easels? Why? Okay, you're giving me that's true. It's all true. That's the abstraction there, primary colors. But what was his thinking about having the primary? Why didn't he have orange and green and purple? Exactly. Because every week some kid would come and say, look, red and blue, it's purple. And if you were a certain kind of teacher, you could say, dummy, weren't you paying attention in the primary, secondary colors lecture that I gave you? Or you could say, oh my God, how did you figure that out? What else could you figure out? See, he was giving the kids opportunities to create, opportunities to discover. And the hidden curriculum was, I'm a powerful person. And discovery and surprise is the name of the game. It's like, I've taught 3 kids and now 3 grandkids, well, the 2 grandkids and 1 on the way, how to ride a bicycle. You know how to ride a bicycle, don't you? Okay, listen quickly, listen to me carefully. You're riding your bicycle and you start to fall to the right. Which way do you turn the wheel? Quick, which way? You're falling to the right. Which way? If you turn to the left, you're gonna go right on your ass. You know why? Because you're riding in a gyroscope. You're sitting in the middle of a gyroscope. Didn't you know that? Didn't you listen to my lecture on gyroscopes earlier in the year? Okay, the point is, we know so many things and we know them so well, but they're not the kind of knowledge that you think of as these kind of lecturing bits of information kind of knowledge. So what Kevin was doing with the red, yellow, and blue paint was letting them have a hidden curriculum of power rather than a curriculum that says, I know and you don't know. So my 6-year-old granddaughter, she stays overnight with us every Saturday. So a couple months ago, she was in the bathtub and she was singing us the days of the week. She was teaching us the days of the week. It's apparently on the Common Core curriculum. So anyway, I learned it. I wasn't objecting. It was fine. And I said to her, Lighty, why don't you teach your class the song we sing about the months of the year? And she looked at me disgusted and said, Bill, there's no time for that. This is kindergarten. It's not pre-K. And I was like, in other words, she's already learned that school is a timetable and the teacher knows and you don't know. And what Kevin was doing was just the opposite. He was saying, if you interact with a complicated world and I set up an environment that's deep enough and rich enough, you can make knowledge. You can build knowledge. And those kids who discovered purple were never going to forget primary and secondary colors. I have a little formula about primary and secondary. I don't know crap about primary and secondary, but these kids did, right? Then, Kevin, I'm back to my son in the first grade parent meeting. So then this teacher said something to us that was extraordinary and has stayed with me forever. He said, I've discovered with Chesa that if I give him a real task, a real job to do, several of you told me you were SPED teachers and becoming SPED teachers, and this is a very SPED gesture because my son was very special ed. And he said, I've discovered that if I give Chesa a real job to do, like if I say to him, take all the books off the bookshelf, get some water and soap, wash the bookshelves, dry them, and then put the books back, Chesa can stay at that for 40 minutes. That was a brilliant kind of understanding that he had by seeing this child for who he was. And then he said something really profound. He said, what that does is it brings Chesa into clearer focus for himself, for me, and for the other students, but most importantly for himself. He now sees himself as a person who can do and make and contribute, a valuable member of the classroom. It doesn't solve everything. He still has temper tantrums. He still knocks over the other kids' block buildings. But he's the block wrecker who can also clean the shelves. That makes all the difference in the world. What a genius teacher in the first grade to discover that about my kid. My kid didn't learn to read until the third grade. I mean, and teachers put up with a lot of crap from him. But he did learn to read in the third grade, and he met on and on. I'll just brag about him for a minute. So he didn't learn to read till the third grade, didn't have a friend until the fifth grade, went on to go to Yale on a full scholarship and became a Rhodes Scholar, went to England, and is now beyond. But that's what can happen. But this is a kid nobody gave up on. This is a kid that people believed in, and his teachers believed in him. And that first grade teacher was an extraordinary person. So the challenge, how do I create an environment that's deep enough and rich enough? How do I then communicate to these kids? Not only, I mean, yes, you have to find a way to build bridges from what they know to deeper and wider ways of knowing. But there are some very important lessons that you have to communicate to your kids in a range of different ways, but you have to believe it about yourself first. And the first lesson, the first most important lesson is you are a unique human being. You're the one and only human being like you who will ever walk the earth. You believe that about yourself, don't you? Nobody's like you exactly. Isn't that correct? I mean, I was just talking to you all up here, and every one of you was absolutely unique. Nobody's exactly like you. And the paradox is you are also a human being, and in that sense, we're all the same. Some are older, some are younger, some are African American, some are white, some are Latino, et cetera, et cetera. But we're also all sharing a human experience and a human culture. So the paradox is you're the one and only, and you're part of the community. How do you build a classroom that communicates all that? And I think that's a very, very important aspect of what we teach kids. The second thing that's important is that you're living in a going world. The world is already going when you arrive into it, and it's changing all the time. So what you do in the world matters. You have to take yourself seriously in the world as well as have a lot of fun. But you have to take yourself seriously because what you do or don't do makes a huge difference. And that's true for you as teachers, and it's true for your students as well. And the third very important lesson is that you need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You can ask questions of the world without asking permission whether you can ask questions of the world. And I know we all live in institutions where we feel the constraints of that, and so we start to question it, but it's absolutely important that you communicate to your students a sense of agency. And by agency, I mean the ability to ask questions, the ability to do and to make. The interesting thing is the powerful people in society always grant to themselves the capacity to have a history, to have dreams, to have wishes, to have culture, to have, the ability to do things, the freedom to do things. But the powerful also talk about the rest of us in categorical terms: race, gender, neighborhood, income, level of education. That's not fair, and it's not right, and you need to figure out with your own students that they shouldn't inhale that kind of logic. They should have the logic that I don't need anyone's permission to ask questions of the universe. And part of the way you show kids that that's true is you're willing to ask questions of the world without restraint, without feeling that you don't have either the courage or the wherewithal to do it. So when a kid says to me in that opening, when I'm first teaching, "Why is that man sleeping in the gutter?" I could say, "We don't talk about that here," or "We'll get to that in second grade," or "Ask your mother, I don't want to talk about it." Or we could say, "I'm not sure, I wonder, let's find out." That's absolutely what you can do. And the interesting thing is that the world comes into your classroom again and again, and teachers spend a lot of time pushing the world out, when what we ought to do is invite the world in. And we ought to take the occasion to show kids how it's done. So I often think that what we ought to be thinking about is a curriculum of questioning, a curriculum of asking questions, and not be so sure. My favorite experiences with the teachers of my own children were instances where a teacher would say, for example, one teacher said, early childhood teacher, said, every year I think of something that I want to explore with the kids that I don't know much about, but I want to explore it. One year it's whales. One year it's monsters in, I don't know, one year it's steel. I remember steel. Steel? Why would you do that? But what she said, and which proved to be true, is whatever she selected as a point of common inquiry was suddenly everywhere. Kids were bringing in articles about whales. Ranger Rick's cover was about whales. The National Geographic did a special edition about whales. Now, was that just luck? No, it turns out whatever you choose, there's a lot in the world. You just don't notice it. You're not focused on it. But when you focus on it, it becomes something. And that particular teacher just had these kids dancing with joy about discovering things in the world. Now, you could say, well, why whales? Why not whales? I mean, what they were learning was curiosity and inquiry and all these kind of things. I remember once when I was teaching teachers, we were thinking about these kinds of inquiry projects. And we got together one week, and a second grade teacher said, you know, I was going to do, in my second grade science unit, we were doing rocks. And so I thought, well, I'll take the kids down to this little river near the school and we'll collect rocks. And they went down there and they started to collect rocks. And she was going to do a 2 or 3 week unit on rocks with the second grade. And she said, but we got down by the river and the kids kept looking at the fish. Look, there's a brown one, there's an orange one, there's a gold one. And she said, I kind of threw caution to the wind and I said, let's do fish and not rocks. And so they did fish in literature, fish in history, fish. They had pet fish, they ate fish, not the pets. They ate other fish and fish recipes. And then she said this very telling thing. She said, the whole time we were doing the fish, I was feeling guilty about the rocks. And you think, what the hell? You know, I mean, it's like there's not a 3-week knowledge about rocks or fish. In fact, there are still people getting PhDs in both rocks and fish. So the idea that somehow it's the rocks themselves, this is the Common Core mentality, right? The rocks matter. No, they don't. The rocks, I mean, take yourself or take me. In an infinite expanding universe, your knowledge is this big. You know almost nothing. You know, but you somehow leverage that little bit that you know to be here at Towson. You just know a little, but you've leveraged it to be here. What else is there to know? How can you keep your eyes open and discover? This is incidentally why in Chicago, where I work, every 3rd grade teacher is angry at who? Besides the kids and the parents. Every 3rd grade teacher is angry at who? Of course. Why are they angry at the 2nd grade teacher? Because the kids aren't ready for 3rd grade. And every 5th grade teacher is angry at every 4th grade teacher. And every high school teacher is angry at all the elementary school teachers. And we professors are angry at all of y'all because the kids aren't ready. You know, I mean, the kids need to be ready. But that's a fool's errand. That makes no sense. What you want is your kids to be ready to ask questions, to interrogate the universe, to find out, to be filled with wonder. I mean, that's where progress comes from, is the great sentence, I don't know, but I'd like to find out. And the fact is that you in an infinite expanding universe, there's an infinite expanding number of things to find out about. And if you yourself show the kids what it means to be curious, what it means to wonder, what it means to pursue things when they come up. So Brian Schultz, who's at UIC, a teacher, he discovered, and incidentally, wherever you teach, you will find cracks where you can do what I'm describing. He discovered that nobody cared about social studies in the 5th grade where he taught. Reading, math. Okay, we'll throw in social studies on Friday at 2 o'clock, but reading, math. And so Brian took social studies and made it into a curriculum of inquiry. And he asked the kids, what would you like to study about our neighborhood, about our community? And they nominated categories, gangs, guns, you know, a million things. And they settled on, let's investigate why our school is falling down physically And the school, the magnet school 5 blocks away is state of the art. Let's investigate that. And he had the courage to do it. It started off being kind of shaky and marginal and weird until it hit the news media and this, and then the mayor came and embraced them. He started small, but he found a way to go with his kids in that courageous endeavor. For those of you who are high school kids, my brother, who I wrote this book with, I think we wrote about this in this book, about the Indian kid, the kid from India. I think we did. He read an obituary in the Oakland Tribune and brought it into his journalism class. And the obituary was of a young 15-year-old Indian girl from India. And there was nothing about the girl. And so 2 of his students took up the task of writing a story about the girl by investigating who she was. To make a long story short, they spent 3 weeks uncovering the largest smuggling ring of domestic workers into the United States in history, in California history. And they blew the lid off of it. And they won every journalism prize, not kiddie journalism, California Journalism Prize that year for their inquiry into who this young woman was. They discovered that there was a great racket of bringing in cheap labor from India. And that was just by asking a question. How could we find out about this kid? Well, I could go on, but you see my point. My point is that this is very much kind of in the spirit of teaching kids the important lesson that the world is apprehendable, that you can participate in it, that you can make a difference in it, and you have to be willing to have the courage to follow your own questions and your own concerns. So as you go off into teaching, those are some of the things I'd like you to wonder about and worry about, is how to be the kind of teacher that really does the service of a free and democratic society, creating free and democratic kids, people who can participate fully in the life of our community and our culture. And that to me means that not only are you doing intellectual work, but your work is the highest ethical work that one can imagine. And that's why you have to take yourself very seriously. I don't mean in a grim way, but you have to take yourself seriously enough to push back on those lawyers and others who kind of patronize us and act like what we're doing is cute, and say, this is ethical work. It makes a difference in the world. I am the person who shepherds the dreams of all other people. Mine is the calling of other callings. And with that in mind, I think we need to stand up for ourselves and fight the battle to see teaching for what it really is. Thank you very much. Now, we have lots and lots of times for conversation, so anywhere you want to go, we will go. Is anyone shy? I asked first, is anyone shy? If you're shy, put up your hand. Okay, ask that guy goes first. You have a question? Comment? Anything? You don't have to. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot just because you're a fan of the Washington Capitals. That's all good.
Are ethics really important in schools, ethical principles?
Say that again. I didn't hear the beginning.
Are ethics important in schools?
Well, what I'm saying is, I'm describing a kind of ethics. And for me, the ethical question is always a question not of a set of rules. It's a question of understanding what your first principles are. So if you start from the assumption that all human beings are of incalculable value, which is what I urge, or if your starting point is that every human being deserves respect, recognition, fairness, equity, if you start there, a lot of particular problems get solved, or at least you know where you stand on a lot of particular problems. But one of the other things about classrooms, and you're going to find this right away, are any of you worried about classroom management? Any of you? Good. Anybody else? She's the only person who's paying attention. Okay, and the reason is because you may not know this, but there are more of them than there are of you. Did you know that? So if they ever get organized, they could tie you up and put you in the closet. They won't, but they could. The reason I raise this is because we spend there's a good reason to be worried about classroom management, and that is that we have all the images of out-of-control kids and parents who don't care and all the rest of it, which is largely false, frankly. But beyond that, there are too many kids. There will be too many kids in your classroom, and not enough resources, and not enough people, not enough adults, and not enough focus, and so on. This is a true fact, and therefore, and a lot of the kids, and it doesn't take many, but a lot of the kids in the schools I've worked in don't really want to be there. And if you think of a class of 30, how many would it take who really don't want to be there to wreck the class? And if you're thinking about it, some would say 1, and that's probably true. But certainly 5, I mean, forget about it. You're doomed. So worrying about it is okay. But I want to reframe classroom management and discipline in a very different way, just like this teacher I was telling you about, Kevin Sweeney, reframed the notion of talking about children. And I would like you to think about classroom management this way. Think about whatever you're teaching. You're teaching a curriculum of some type, which Robert was saying is about what knowledge and experiences are of most value. We could talk about that. But next to that curriculum is another curriculum. And that curriculum is called Learning to Live Together. Capital letters, Learning to Live Together. And that curriculum is as important in a kindergarten as it is in graduate school. It's as important in graduate school as it is in kindergarten. It's important in kindergarten. And what I mean by that is even in graduate school, even in your college classrooms, you've already noticed that some people talk too much, like the professor. Some people don't talk enough. Some people you can't draw out for the life of you. Some people are kind of dominant. Some people are disrespectful. Some are more respectful. Learning to live together is a lifetime job. It's something that goes on forever. So in a kindergarten classroom, learning to live together includes things like learning to use your words. You don't punch people out when you disagree with them. You don't bite people in a preschool, even though you feel like biting people because you're teething and but you're not allowed. But every act of misbehavior, whether it's kindergarten or 5th grade or junior high or high school, is actually an occasion for what early childhood people call the teachable moment. It's not the moment to bring down the rule, and that's not where ethics lies. Ethics does not lie in imposing the rule or giving stars or having people write on the board. Ethics lies in solving the real world problems based on some principles. If the principle is every human being is valuable, if the principle is we respect and recognize everyone, then when a fight happens, that's not the occasion to stifle it. It's the occasion for a teachable moment. And sometimes that teachable moment happens the next day when you're sitting in circle before class begins. And you say, remember yesterday when Reynard punched out Dahlia? Reynard's looking down. You say, remember, now we have to use our words. Yes. And we're going to do better today. Yes. And we had a difference of opinion. But often there's a wonderful book that I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but it had a great title. And it was called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. And the idea of it was very simple, which is you get two kids in a fight and you sit in the hallway when things have calmed down. I mean, when I worked in the juvenile detention center, I was with these big gangbanging kids. And I found even there, I was this old white guy, and I found even there that kids don't want to fight. Kindergartners don't want to fight. High schoolers don't want to fight. They're very happy when you intervene and stop them. You can see them relax. They're like tense, and then, whew, and I'd stand between these two giants, and they just calm down because, nobody wants to really be vulnerable in those ways. But, when you have a calm moment, you sit down with the two kids, and you say, Robert, why did you hit Brett? Well, she took my homework. And then you turn to Brett and you say, Brett, he thinks you took his work. But I didn't take his work. I was just borrowing it. She thinks that you just borrow. In other words, you're just giving them their own words. I know, sibling rivalry and everything. But you're just giving them opportunities to think. But what you're teaching is that conflict is normal, but we have ways of resolving it. We can learn from it. Or another example, somebody says, no girls can come in the block area. That's a teachable moment. That's a moment for discussion, not a moment to impose the rule. Remember, we have gender equity here. No, it's a time, why would he say that? Why did he say that? Let's get to the bottom of it. Let's understand it. And sometimes, if we're uncomfortable, we can't talk about the things with kids that make us uncomfortable at our own adult level. I remember once, one of my kids was in 5th grade, and he came home and he said 2 kids were suspended from school for having a fight in the lunchroom. I said, what was the fight about? Well, Peter called Jim a Pollock, and Jim called Peter the N-word. And I said, wow. And then he said, yeah, I mean, which do you think is worse? He said, this is my son saying to me, which word is worse? And I'm like, holy cow, that's a complicated thing to talk about. So we talked about it for quite a while. And then he said, well, why did the black kids call themselves that name sometimes? That was another complicated talk to have with a 10-year-old, right? And so I went to school the next day and I said, wow, all the kids are buzzing about this fight that happened. We should have a conversation in advisory with all the kids. What did the principal say? Absolutely not, for 2 reasons. One is the math tests are coming. That's really important stuff. And number 2, we don't have a race problem here, and you're just going to stir one up. And I said, ooh, where do you live that I don't live? We're on the south side of Chicago. We're in America. No. You'll make a race problem where there isn't one. Well, the kids called each other these names, right? So that's what I mean about you have to have the courage yourself. And one of the great things about teaching is kids push us to be better. They always push us to be more ethical than we actually are. So when Zaid, my 37-year-old son, was 5 and just learning to read, we were on a bus in Manhattan on our way to daycare and school and work. And now picture this, we're on a bus, a crowded Manhattan bus, and Zaid says to me in a great big outside voice with about 300 people listening, Papi, what's a kike? Do you all know what that means? You can Google it. It's the N-word for Jew. It's the most racist thing you could say about Jewish people. And so we're in New York, so the bus has 300 people, so go figure. There's a lot of Jewish people on there, including him, my son. And so I'm a teacher, so I buy time. You know, I'm like, where did you hear that word? And since he's just learning to read, he's 5, he sounded it out. And he said, look, it's there. I hate kikes, written in big marker. And I'm like, whew. So ordinarily, I would see something like that, and I would just not even pay attention. What do I want to get involved in that crap? You know, I wouldn't pay. But now my 5-year-old asked me in a big outside voice in front of 300 witnesses. So I pulled myself together and I said, that's a hateful word. It's a word filled with violence and anger. It's a word we never use. It's a word we always oppose. And I felt so good about myself that I had done the right thing until Zaid said, well, aren't you going to cross it out? And I'm like, shit, dude, haven't I done enough? You know what I mean? You know, I've done the most I can do. No, I didn't say that. I said, of course. And I pulled out a magic marker and crossed it off. I wouldn't have done that if he hadn't made me do it. Do you get what I'm saying? So that's true for you too. Kids make us our best selves if we allow them to. If we listen to them and they say, that's not fair, that doesn't seem fair, you know, so I'll just think of one other example. When I took a bunch of kids, we were in PS 84 in New York City across from a firehouse, and a lot of the kids were on fire with the idea that the fire department was going to now hire women. This was in the, I guess, mid-'80s. And they were excited about it, and some of the mothers were feminists and so on. So we went over to the firehouse and took a tour. And during the tour, Caitlin, one of these little 4-year-old, 5-year-old kids, said to Jimmy, who was a nice firefighter showing us around, Jimmy, when are you going to get a woman in this firehouse? And Jimmy exploded, and he said, women, they can't fight fires. The whole neighborhood would burn down. We don't want any women here. Caitlin was aghast. You know, she was like filled with the kind of incipient feminism of a 5-year-old with a feminist mother. And she was just horrified. So when we got back, she was kind of almost in tears. And she said, what are we going to do about it? And we said, well, what do you want to do about it? And we talked, and we agreed we would write a letter to the fire department and to Mayor Koch, explaining that we needed women firefighters on 84th Street. Well, it's kind of silly, but years later, when Caitlin was applying to college, she talked about that incident in her college essay. That's how significant it was to this 5-year-old. You just don't know how important you are in the lives of these kids. You could be the one who said, you know, I affirm you, I affirm your anger, I affirm your insight, I affirm your wonder. I think that's a great thing, and that's what ethics, practical ethics, means to me in those kind of situations. Sorry, that was one question and kind of a long answer.
What's the biggest mistake you've made as a teacher?
Oh gosh, it's constant. You know, I mean, I think that the life of a teacher is to make mistakes constantly. I mean, that's and the trouble is, and I'll tell you a couple mistakes, but I mean, the trouble is that you have to, as I said, I wish for all of you that you would say out loud to yourself and to your colleagues, here are my commitments, here's what I'm trying to do as a teacher, this is why I'm becoming a teacher. And then you know you will fall short. So here's the rhythm that I think you have to have. I think the rhythm is you have to be willing to end every day by saying, I could have done better. If you don't do that, then you're going to become one of those teachers who says, I was great, the little bastards didn't learn anything, but that's their fault. You know, and that's not the teacher you want to be. Every day, there's something you could have done better in terms of this corner of this room or this interaction. You could have been smarter, you could have been more caring, you could have been more thoughtful in your response. And then you have to get up the next morning and forgive yourself for being human. Because it's not that you're a hypocrite, it's not that you're a bad person. It's that in this complicated life that we lead, in the complicated interaction that is teaching, you have to keep growing and keep learning. So my son Malik, who's a 10-year middle school teacher, I told him after I visited him recently, I said, you're a great, great teacher. And what I meant was he knew every kid's name. He had 50 kids come in his math class that morning. Knew every kid's name, knew something about every kid, knew to say, Heather, how's your mother since the operation? Knew to say, remember what you're going to do after school today, Hector, and so on. And I love that. I love the way he grouped them in desks, you know, 6 desks to a pod. I loved everything about what he was doing. I said, you're a great teacher. And he said, Pops, I'm not a great teacher. I'm a guy who shows up every day and tries to be a better teacher. That's a definition of a great teacher right there. Try to show up every day and be a better teacher, because there is no end point in learning how to teach. But I can remember lots of times, including a couple weeks ago when I got angry at one of my granddaughters, and I just was stricken with guilt for 24 hours, because I don't want to be angry with them, even though she was being a pain in the butt and ran in the street. Even then, I don't want to be angry. I want to be firm, but I don't need to be angry. And so those are the kind of mistakes that come back to me all the time. Stupid things that are said, opportunities missed. But it's in the nature of the game, just absolutely in its nature. Yes, ma'am.
I don't think I need a mic, but I had a chance at...
You can project. You must have taught middle school.
I had a chance at ADRA last week to sort of see Bill Schuberg and William Watkins speak about equity and love and social justice in education. And I'm just wondering, something that came up was this idea that we need to build relationships with our students, but at the same time, we're now fighting a system where schools especially are putting things in place to actually break down those relationships, whether it's preventing students and teachers from interacting online, preventing students and teachers from being able to relate to social media, and all those other sorts of issues. How do you suggest to new teachers and me as someone who will eventually train teachers to sort of deal with this issue?
Well, one thing is, I do think that your first responsibility is to become a good teacher. I mean, you talk about social justice, you have to be a good teacher. You can't just be a person who's standing in the corner saying, I'm for equity, woohoo. You have to be a good teacher, and so that takes work. And when you see these short-termers, like I was talking to a Teach for America person, and incidentally, all of them are lovely people. The system sucks, but the Teach for America kids are great. And I said to this one person who'd had 3 months of training and was now 6 months a teacher, I said, how do you think it's going as a teacher? She said, I'm a great teacher. And I said, I'm sorry, but I apologize, you're not a great teacher. Because it takes 5 years just to get your feet under you as a teacher. It's a hard, hard job. And I've been at it since 1965. I still face every class that I teach with a sense of dread and wonder and hope and fear, and as you will. The difference between me and you is that I've done it so long that I trust the craft. I think if I just show up and do stuff, eventually something will happen. One of the things I learned also as a kindergarten teacher, and I see that Robert has got this in his repertoire too, is always have food, even if you're teaching graduate school, because all else can go to hell, and at least you fed the kids, and so get food afterwards. But there's never been a school that I've been in, and frankly, I've been in a lot of schools, I've been in a few prisons. There's not even a prison I've been in that there aren't cracks where you can do what you think is valuable. There are always cracks. And so my niece, who teaches in the South Bronx, first grade, which is a real drill and kill school, and she found that nobody cared about lunch. Nobody actually was paying attention to what she would do at lunch. So she worked her schedule so that for 40 minutes at lunch and break, she would create a literacy program that was her program. That was the way she wants to do literacy. Interest in books, poetry, speaking, imaginative writing, and so on. So there for 40 minutes, she had her thing going on, right? And so she built relationships in that moment, which she couldn't have done when she was under that hyper surveillance of the system. Look for the cracks and the crannies where you can be the teacher you want to be. Find a way to be the teacher you want to be some of the time, not all the time. That's one very important rule. Second, find teachers, not necessarily like-minded, but teachers, peers, who want to talk about teaching with you. Here's the problem. Your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your partner, whatever, if they're not teachers, they're not going to be able to share the kind of wisdom that you need to share. I'm a huge believer in teacher talks. Teachers talking to teachers about teaching in a regular way. Now, the problem with teacher talks is they can descend into whining very easily, because we have a lot to whine about. But make a rule, when we get together, let's say 6 of us are going to get together every other Friday for a drink at a bar, and we're going to talk about kids, we're going to bring samples of kids' work, we're going to talk about the environment for learning, we're going to exchange ideas, and you're going to talk back to each other. I could give you a more formal version of that, but that's good enough. You need other teachers to talk to in a regular way about the content and conduct of teaching. Third, don't go potluck into the Baltimore schools. Don't go potluck. Don't give yourself up too easily. Demand something. 8 years ago, one of my really wonderful older students, he was an undergraduate, but I think he was about 28. And when we were talking about how to get a job, he came to that class session at the university with a paper that I have with me that he called My Questions to Ask the Principal at Every Interview I Go on. So in other words, we're all, everybody else is feeling like, how am I going to dress? How am I going to look? How will I answer his questions? And Anthony said, what am I going to ask him? It's not a given that I'm going to work for him. So let me ask some questions that will allow me to feel out. So let me just read you 3 or 4 of them. This is Anthony asking somebody who's thinking about hiring him. What is your opinion if I take the first 5 to 7 days of school and dedicate it to community building in my classroom? Well, you learn a lot from a principal if he says, absolutely not, we're on task. What a great question. How do you feel about the idea that teachers need to earn the respect of their students over the first month of school, as opposed to students should respect every adult just for the heck of it? That's a question he's going to ask. I like down near the bottom, he says, Oh, he asks questions like, what's the turnover rate or the mobility rate of the teachers at your school? Pretty good question, don't you think? What if you go to a school and the turnover rate's 90%? That means you'll be there for 6 months and then you'll be gone. You don't want to work there. So don't sell yourself short, you know. Allow yourself to, do you feel minority students, especially black males, are overrepresented in special ed? Holy cow, a little edgy, but I like this one. Do you think Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Ray Charles are people that your students should look up to? If so, what type of music classes are offered in your high school? I mean, crazy stuff, right? And he did it kind of as an intellectual exercise more than something he was actually going to do literally. But I think that's another important thing, is that you don't want to say, I'm just a certified teacher, Towson University stamped on my forehead, hire me please, no matter who you are or what you do. No, you want to work in some schools and not others. At the University of Illinois Chicago, I had 6 teachers one year, all get jobs at the same elementary school. Wow. They went in as a cohort, they started a teacher talk group, they made some changes that were really remarkable because there were 6 of them. And I think that you should think about who do you want to be with and how do you want to be with those people. You got time. And think about how you're going to talk about teaching with each other. I'm looking at the time now. It's 6:30. I'm good forever, but go ahead.
What is your opinion about private schools?
What is my opinion about private schools? I think that we have a. Here's what I think. I think we have a system in this country of public education. We have a system of private education. We have religious education. We have homeschooling, and all of it is legitimate in terms of the overall whole. But our commitment as citizens has to be to a robust, effective, fair, free, common education for everybody. So I'm a huge believer that public education is where we should invest our citizenship, responsibility. And I think it's important this is an important question, and even though this isn't exactly about you in the classroom, I think it's important that you have it in mind. Because as you know, the schools are a great focus of public attention, and there's a lot of conversation, Common Core, and the framing of the conversation about teaching sometimes drives me nuts. Like, for example, every politician who gets to a microphone says, we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom. You've heard that, right? And don't you kind of nod? I do. What do I want? The lazy teacher left there for my granddaughter? Get him out of there. But the problem is, by saying that, he's defined an issue that's not true, and he's already won the argument. If I get to the microphone and say, every kid in an American school deserves an intellectually grounded, morally committed, well-rested, well-paid, curious, and interesting teacher, I win that argument. So who's framing the issue, and how do we have it? In a democracy, even a flawed, imperfect, partial democracy like ours, in a democracy, we base our education, our public education, on the notion that every human being is of incalculable value, as I said earlier. And that's a big difference from schools in any other system. So if you take fascist Germany, or Soviet Albania, or medieval Saudi Arabia, or apartheid South Africa, those educators wanted their kids to stay away from drugs. Those educators wanted their kids to show up on time and do their homework. Those educators wanted their kids not to get pregnant, etc., etc. But what distinguishes them from what we ought to at least aspire to is that they were teaching whatever else they taught, and German schools were wildly effective, but whatever else they taught, literature, drama, art, music, whatever else, science, math, whatever else they taught obedience and conformity. That's the lesson in an authoritarian school. Whatever else we teach, we should teach creativity, imagination, initiative, courage, entrepreneurship. Those are the values that democracy foregrounds or is part of the hidden curriculum. To the extent that we fail to teach those things, we're failing to build the public space that we need if we're going to flourish as a people, as a society. That's the struggle we ought to be engaged in. So one of the things that means to me is that whatever the most privileged people have for their children, private schools say, we ought to, as a community, insist that that's a baseline for all of our children. So, for example, the Obama children, the Arne Duncan children, Arne Duncan's the Secretary of Education. You know who Obama is, right? Yeah, okay. The Obama children, the Duncan children, they go to schools where they have a cap on the number of students in the classroom at 15, where they have teachers who are not only well respected but unionized, where they have curriculum based in part on pursuing your own questions, where they have well-resourced classrooms. If it's good enough for those kids, then it's got to be good enough for the kids on the west side of Chicago. So one of my little crazinesses that I do, one of my little twerks, whatever they are, is that whenever something weird comes down in the Chicago public schools that I object to, I always go to the University of Chicago Laboratory School and ask what they do. I'll give you two examples, one silly and one more profound. The silly one is that last year in the spring, the Chicago Public Schools banned the graphic novel Persepolis. Are some of you guys comic book fans? Yeah? I wrote a comic book about teaching, which Robert didn't mention, but I wrote a book called To Teach the Journey in Comics, and it's an instruction manual on how to learn to teach. But I'm a big fan of comic books. So Persepolis is a story by a young Iranian girl who now lives in France named Marjane Satrapi. And it's the story of the Iranian Revolution seen through the eyes of a 13, 14-year-old girl. Utterly brilliant. It was banned in the Chicago Public Schools at Lane Tech because it has one panel where a boy is peeing in the street and you can see his penis. So somebody objected and they just gone. So I called the lab school, got a hold of the librarian, and I said, do you have Persepolis in the school? Yes, we have 11 copies, 2 in the original French. Really? Yes, and we have the movie. There's a cartoon made of this book that's also brilliant. I said, really? And I said, do the kids read it? She said, it's required reading in the 7th grade. So see, the privileged kids get real art and real literature, and the kids at Lane Tech get one more period of drill and skill. One of the great things that happened off of this is the kids at Lane Tech formed a club called 451, based on the novel Fahrenheit 451, which is the temperature at which books burn. And they started a club called 451, and the whole purpose of the club was just to read banned books. So all they read was banned books, starting with Persepolis. And last year they won the Illinois Library Association First Amendment Award, and they went to Springfield and got this big award. What a great thing for kids with a smart teacher willing to fight back and show them the nonsense that it is. That's what I think we need to all do. I do it literally, and yet I think we all need to do it metaphorically. In a society, in a democracy, whatever the most privileged and wisest parents have for their children, we should demand as a baseline for all of our children, for the community's children. We should never let go of that ideal. As John Dewey says, anything less destroys democracy. If you want a democracy, you have to believe that the fullest development of each of us is the condition for the full development of all of us, and vice versa. The fullest development of all of us is the condition for the full development of any of us. So I'm going to give you one last example from this idea of going to the privileged school. In Illinois, by law, 30% of a Chicago public school teacher's evaluation is based on standardized test scores of their children, of their students. It's anyone who knows about standardized tests, and I could go on for hours, but we're going to stop soon. It's a travesty. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense, but okay. 30% of your evaluation will be based on your kids' test scores. So I went to the laboratory school, and I met with the head of school and the head of the union. And I said, how do you all evaluate teachers? And we had a 2-hour conversation, which I'll spare you. But the gist of it was, what we decided to do was to ask the question, what is good teaching? We asked it in grade levels, we asked it in discipline groups, we asked it of parents, we had meetings about it, we had outside speakers. We spent a year building a culture around asking the question, what is good teaching? Then at the end of that year, we developed 7 domains that we thought you could kind of see good teaching. And then we And then they went through this whole complicated process. If you're a new teacher at lab school, you get a mentor for 2 years. That mentor-teacher relationship, the administration has no access to. At the end of year 1, 2, 3, and 6, an administrator comes and looks at you based on the 7 domains, spends 2 days in your classroom. 1, 2, 3, and 6. And I said, what about those other years? After that, we don't evaluate them at all. We just assume they're part of the culture of good teaching. We're not going to do checklists on people we want you to be here for your whole career. We want you here for 25 years. We don't need to check up on you unless something triggers some horrible event. No. So I thought, wow. So then I said, what role do standardized tests play in evaluating teachers? And they both looked at me like I was from Mars, and they said, what do standardized tests have to do with good teaching? Hello, privileged people. Hello, privileged teachers. That's where we all want to teach. We want to teach in a space that gives you that kind of respect and that kind of assumption. So I think that's my short example. I'm going to take one more, and then we're going to bail out.
So you just alluded to the fact that the political tide has been at for a while now towards standardized testing and towards grading teachers and also grading teachers on some kind of so-called objective scale, often tied to standardized testing. I think that most teachers in the room here feel that these are suspect practices at best. I agree with you that they're completely ridiculous. How do we turn the political tide, how do we turn the larger conversation that the larger democracy is having about teaching away from these things that people seem to be, who aren't teachers, seem to be so invested in and so in love with?
Well, I encouraged you at the beginning to get smart about how you talk about teaching and to fight back against the kind of narrow-minded narrowing of teaching. And there is no, simple answer to your question. That is the question. How do we, as a community of teachers and people who are becoming teachers, learn to frame issues properly, learn to talk to our closest friends and neighbors and family about this, but also learn how to enter the public domain and have this conversation. Part of it is exactly what I've been arguing here, to argue that in larger forums again and again, to write letters to the newspaper. I know you feel like I've got enough to do. I can't write letters to the newspaper. Yes, you can. When something ridiculous is said in the Maryland legislature or the city council, write a letter, be heard, do it collectively, have it be part of your classroom assignment. So we don't want to just be teachers. We want to enter the public space as citizens, right? The other thing is, and so we need to make the argument. And there's a lot more of the argument to be made. For example, you may know this, but America is the most over-tested students in the public schools of any country on earth. There's no one who tests like we do. And when you tell people what we do, if you're in South Africa, or if you're in Finland, or if you're in Holland, they say, really? Why would you do that? What is the point of all that? It's an expensive, ridiculously expensive, and incidentally, private corporations make huge amount of taxpayer money on this thing, and yet it tells us very little, and it does not actually work to improve teaching or learning. So you need to get smarter about that. All of us do. We need to make the argument that Finland tests the least and has the best outcomes on these international tests. We need to know that and make that argument. We need to make the argument that Einstein made, that everything that can be counted doesn't count, and everything that you can count, and everything that counts isn't counted. So how do you count love and generosity, and how do you count curiosity and engagement? These are complicated things, but the beautiful thing about the profession you guys are going into is that education, like love, is generative. That is, it creates more of itself. The great thing about education and love is the more you give away, the more you have. You can give it all away, and you lose nothing. That's a kind of amazing paradoxical wonder. The other thing, so you don't get too discouraged, is that even though the big megaphone, even though the big money, even though the Democrats and the Republicans, even though the media, to a person, whether it's Fox or MSNBC and everybody in between, MSNBC too, All of them favor a regime of standardized testing relentlessly. The interesting thing is 10 years of foundations, government, media pounding us on that. They haven't won the hearts and minds of either parents, teachers, or kids. And so you can go to Chicago and you will see that even though the mayor, the governor, the city council, the president, the secretary of education, the whole Chicago mafia thinks this is the way to go, the parents, the teachers, and the kids disagree. And we actually, we don't have the megaphone, but we actually have not been run over by that train. So I think we need to kind of speak up with a certain amount of confidence, not optimism, confidence, because we're right. And the great thing about that is that you will find you have allies among parents and among kids, and they're the ones who know who cares, and they're the ones who make a difference. You know, I want to end with just, we could go on forever, I could, but you've been sitting on your butt a long time, and I want you to get up and line up. But I want to just end with I was just thinking about the great Chicago poet, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Gwendolyn Brooks, who died in the year 2000, was a marvelous teacher herself, was a neighbor of mine. But she wrote a great, great poem. She wrote so many great poems about democracy and about human beings. But one of her poems was called Boy Breaking Glass. And it's a poem about a bad boy, a kid who's causing trouble. And it's a long, complicated poem about this bad, bad kid. And in the middle of it, she speaks in the voice of the child. And she says, and the child says, through her poem, the child says, I shall create, if not a note, then a whole, if not an overture, then a desecration, but I shall create. And I think it's worth remembering as teachers that you hold in your hands the possibility of opening the creative vent for these kids who desperately want to be heard, desperately want to make a mark in the world, desperately want to be fully human and understood and seen and respected. You could open that vent of creativity and you will find that you'll shrink the destructive vent. Or you could just go ahead on in the status quo and let that destructive vent have full fury, and then we end up in a situation where 2.5 million of our fellow citizens are in prison, where the schools are crumbling, where the public space is disappearing. It's not the world you and I want to live in. That's not why you became teachers. So go forth, do good, and again, thanks for having me.